At the start of the Civil War in 1861, we see that the United States military structure was pretty ill prepared to deal with going to war, let alone a civil war. In total, they had about 16,000 troops after many of the Southerners had left to join the Confederate Army. So what we see from a very early starting point, there's going to be a tremendous need for volunteers, especially as the war drags into 1861 and 1862. Now, for the most part, the recruitment of these various regiments were the responsibility of state governors. I have a campaign poster here that looks very exciting about trying to join a Union cavalry unit. And what we see is that there was a lot of regimental and estate pride in these regiments. Regiments all came from one particular state, usually one particular county, or one particular area from a particular state. So what that means is there was a lot of closeness and cohesiveness among the regiments. But as we saw with the cornfield at Antietam, sometimes this closeness and cohesiveness of these regiments could come at a cost, where a regiment could get into a very difficult battle, and there could be the fact that all the young men in that town are either dead or maimed in such a way or missing and never found again. The United States government faced a number of disappointments in 1862. Not only did McClellan fail them in the Peninsula Campaign, but in the recruiting offices, many men did not answer Lincoln's call for additional troops. So that's going to cause Lincoln and the Congress to pass the first ever conscription law in March of 1863. Conscription is a fancy word for the draft. The new conscription law required or stated that all able-bodied men between the ages of 20 and 45 were eligible for military service, and if selected, they would serve a 3-year commitment. Now, each state had a quota, meaning each state had to produce a certain number of soldiers. And the way they decided how many men would be drafted is they would take, okay, what is the quota of soldiers that each state needs to provide? Subtract that from the number of volunteers, and whatever the difference would be the number of men drafted. Now, the conscription law was not without controversy. Early on in the Civil War, there were two ways in which you could get out of the war. First way you could do it is you could pay your way out, something called commutation. For $300, the approximate wage of a typical worker in 1863, a person could pay their way out and not have to serve. Now, this was primarily basically for the well-to-do or those with a little bit of money. Most people were not eligible for that. In addition, you could also find a substitute where you would ask your buddy, hey, why don't you go in my place? Now, there were usually some strings attached with that, but those were two ways in which you could get out of the United States draft in 1863. Democrats were especially opposed to the draft. They did not like this increased power of the national government. In addition, they felt that the draft violated an individual's free rights and liberties. You're going to force someone to go against their will to go and fight in the army. So needless to say, there was a lot of draft violence and people protesting against the conscription laws. We can think back, if we remember in our U.S. history classes, the Vietnam protests. Something similar would happen in 1863. It was in New York City where we see the biggest and probably some of the worst violence related to the draft. The Democratic governor at the time, Horatio Seymour, attacked both Lincoln and the Republican Party for the conscription's violation of liberty. In a speech, he stated that conscription was not only unconstitutional, but was also unfair, and that Democrats and those Democratic-leaning citizens were more likely to get drafted than their Republican counterparts. What this did is this incensed the people of New York, and after the first names were drawn in July of 1863, all hell broke loose in New York City. Businesses were stoned and burned, telegraph wires were cut throughout the city, and mobs fought with the police. of specific attack during the draft riots were African Americans. See, we have to think about the Emancipation Proclamation was put out there in January 1st, 1863. The draft is coming about. And what we see is the Democrats in 1863 played on the racist tendencies. You know, they would attack Lincoln for be willing to sacrifice the whites of white men, allowing them to go off and fight in the war, while still giving African Americans freedom from slavery. And what we see, the violence was horrific against African Americans. One black man trying to escape at night was caught by a gang of men and boys and hung from a chestnut tree in the city. The rioters also destroyed and burned the colored orphanage asylum. These guys came in, they threw Molotov cocktails through the window, the whole building was on fire while the kids were asleep. Now, luckily, the kids were able to escape. But what we see and what this all demonstrates is that the draft was very unpopular in the North. Now, luckily, there's going to be enough volunteers in the North where they're not going to have to be so heavily reliant upon the draft, but it is still going to cause a tremendous amount of controversy. The South is going to have a much more difficult time than the North in able to gathering troops and forces. As we look back at in the last unit, the South was outnumbered by the North by more than 4-1. But what we see, just like in the North, the Battle of Fort Sumter became a large rallying cry in the South. But in the Confederate version, Lincoln had refused to listen to the Southern peace proposals and provided them no alternative but to attack the fort. Davis and the South saw the Confederacy as a peaceful nation, drawn into a war against a hostile Northern aggressor. Well, what we see is almost from the very start of the war, the South, had some folks that were hell-bent on fighting and destroying the Yankee army. But what we see is the South was ill-equipped and ill-prepared. Early on in the war, an estimated 200,000 volunteers had to be turned away due to lack of supplies and lack of guns. But as 1861 and 1862 go through and the South goes through some tough battles, they too are going to have to turn to conscription. But they're going to have a much, much, much more difficult time in finding troops in the Union Army. In April of 1862, the Confederacy will pass their first ever conscription law. They at first said, hey, but guys between 18 and 35. Later extending this to guys between the ages of 17 and 50. The chief function, though, of the Confederacy was not so much to draft men, but to force them to volunteer to avoid being perceived as the disgrace of being drafted. But what we're going to see is there were just too few soldiers, too few people who were that inspired by the Confederate cause who did not initially actually join the Confederate Army.